Many talented people of colour were snubbed in major categories. Unfortunately, there's nothing we can do about that. The Hollywood foreign press are all very, very racist.
Ricky Gervais stood at
three of the biggest names in entertainment. Three completely different falls from grace. And this year, all three stories finally caught up to the truth. Ricky Gervais said the thing nobody else would say on live television, in front of the exact people he was talking about. Ellen DeGeneres built a 19-year brand on 4 words, and then the people who work for her told a very different story. And Wendy Williams, the woman who built her whole career on saying what everyone else was too scared to say, is still fighting in court right now just to be believed. These are not rumors. These are documented, on-the-record events, and by the end of this video you'll understand exactly what happened to each of them, and why their stories still matter today. Let's start with the moment that everyone remembers, but almost nobody fully understood at the time. January 2020, the Golden Globes, the Beverly Hilton Ballroom. Ricky Gervais walks out for his 5th and, as it turned out, final time hosting the show. He's got a beer in his hand, and within the first few minutes he tells the room flat out that he doesn't care anymore, that this is his last time doing this, and that he's going to say what he wants. That got a laugh. What came after did not. He tore into Felicity Huffman over the college admission scandal. He went after Apple, Amazon, and Disney by name, telling actors in the room that if ISIS started a streaming service, they'd sign a deal with them too. He didn't spare the audience. He told them they knew nothing about the real world, despite thanking their agents, God, and Harvey Weinstein in their speeches. That last name landed differently than the others. The room, full of the most powerful and famous people on the planet, went quiet in a way award show audiences rarely do. Not a groan. Not a nervous laugh. Silence. Cameras caught faces that had clearly stopped finding it funny. What made that night stick in people's memory for years afterward wasn't just the jokes about specific scandals everyone already knew about. It was the tone. Gervais wasn't performing damage control or trying to stay invited back. He said afterward, in more than one interview, that he knew it would probably be his last time hosting, and he was fine with that trade. He's talked about growing up watching British comedy, where the host of a show is basically a court jester, someone whose entire job is to say the uncomfortable thing out loud because everyone else in the room has too much to lose. He wasn't trying to be liked by the 200 famous people sitting in front of him. He said his real audience was the people watching from home, the ones who don't get invited to the parties and don't have a publicist smoothing things over the next morning. He never hosted the Golden Globes again after that night, and has said so himself, without any bitterness about it, more like he expected it. He kept working. He kept doing stand-up. He kept making the same kinds of jokes about hypocrisy in the entertainment industry in his specials and interviews over the following years. Then in 2025, the Department of Justice released a large batch of documents connected to Jeffrey Epstein, including flight logs, financial records, and internal communications involving people across entertainment, finance, and politics. Names that had circulated for years as rumor and speculation were now sitting inside real court and investigative files. It's important to be precise here, because this is where a lot of online commentary goes off the rails. The 2025 document released did not prove every joke Gervais told in 2020 word for word, and Gervais never claimed it did either. What he did say, in a follow-up interview, was that watching the story unfold over those 5 years felt less like breaking news and more like a slow confirmation of things a lot of people in the industry had quietly known or suspected for a long time. That's a very different claim than he predicted everything, and it's worth being honest about the distinction, because the honest version is actually more interesting. Gervais wasn't a prophet. He was a comedian repeating what insiders already understood, out loud, at the one moment a year when the cameras were pointed directly at them. Now let's talk about Ellen DeGeneres, because her story runs on a completely different track, even though people often lump it in with the same conversation about Hollywood accountability. For 19 seasons, the Ellen DeGeneres show closed every single episode with the same line, "Be kind to one another." It became more than a sign-off. It became the entire brand. Merchandise, interviews, her public persona, all of it was built around that phrase, and for most of the show's run it worked. Ellen was one of the most trusted faces on daytime television. That image took a serious hit in the summer of 2020, when BuzzFeed News published an investigation built on interviews with dozens of former staff and production employees. The picture they described was a workplace that felt nothing like the show's branding. People described a culture of fear, senior producers accused of racist and dismissive behavior toward staff, and an environment where raising concerns wasn't welcomed. Multiple additional reports followed in the weeks after, with more former employees coming forward. Warner Media, which produced the show, opened an internal investigation. In the aftermath, 3 top producers left the show. Ellen addressed the controversy directly at the start of her next season, telling her audience that things had happened on the show that shouldn't have, and that she took responsibility as the person whose name was on the door. The show continued for 2 more seasons after that, but the reputation never fully recovered, and in 2021 Ellen announced it would end. The final episode aired in May 2022, closing out 19 years on air. Here's where the story often gets exaggerated online, and it's worth setting straight. A lot of viral content frames Ellen's move to the United Kingdom as some kind of dramatic escape from the fallout of that workplace scandal, time to avoid consequences. That's not what the record actually shows. Ellen and her wife, Portia de Rossi, had owned property in the Cotswolds for a while before making it their full-time home. Ellen has said directly, in interviews given after the move, that the decision to relocate permanently was tied to the outcome of the 2024 U.S. presidential election, not to the show controversy from years earlier, which had already been dealt with publicly through the investigation, the departures, and her on-air apology. She's described settling into a much quieter life on a farm in rural England, doing chores, keeping animals, occasionally admitting on camera that she misses the pace of doing a show. More recently, reports have described her splitting time between England and a home she and Portia purchased back in California, suggesting the move isn't as final or as dramatic as some headlines want it to be. The honest version of Ellen's story is less of a scandal-driven disappearance and more of a genuine, well-documented workplace accountability story from 2020, followed years later by an unrelated lifestyle and political decision. Both things are true. They are just not the same story, and stitching them together into one dramatic arc isn't accurate. Now to the story that, out of these 3, involves the most real and ongoing human stakes, Wendy Williams. Before there was a Wendy Williams show, there was Wendy Williams on the radio in New York in the 1990s, building a reputation for saying names and details about people in the music industry that other hosts wouldn't touch. That reputation cost her jobs more than once, something she's talked about openly, including in a well-known conversation with Howard Stern, where she connected her on-air comments about powerful industry figures directly to getting let go from a station. She kept coming back anyway, and by the time her own daytime talk show launched in 2008, she'd built an audience specifically because she was willing to say things other hosts avoided. The Wendy Williams show ran for 14 seasons, but by the early 2020s, Wendy's health had become a visible part of the story too, with on-air moments and cancelled tapings that raised public concern. In 2022, Wells Fargo, the bank managing her finances, filed a petition raising concerns about her ability to handle her own affairs, describing worries about undue influence and financial exploitation. That led to a New York court appointing a professional guardian, an attorney named Sabrina Morrissey, with authority over both Wendy's finances and significant parts of her personal life. This is what's known in New York as an Article 81 guardianship. In 2023, she was diagnosed with frontotemporal dementia and aphasia, a diagnosis her guardians team has pointed to as the basis for keeping the arrangement in place. Wendy has disputed that diagnosis publicly and repeatedly. In a phone call to The Breakfast Club in early 2025, she said directly that she did not believe she was cognitively impaired and described feeling isolated and controlled rather than protected. She said in multiple interviews that she felt like she was living under conditions closer to captivity than care. In late 2025, her legal team pointed to results from an independent neurological evaluation that reportedly did not find evidence of frontotemporal dementia, a discrepancy that directly conflicts with the diagnosis her guardian has used to justify the arrangement. Her attorney, Joe Tuckerpina, said publicly at the time that he expected the guardianship could end by the close of 2025, and that he was prepared to push for a jury trial if a judge resisted. That deadline came and went. As of the middle of 2026, the guardianship is still active. Court filings are still being exchanged. Her son, Kevin Hunter Jr., has been vocal in public and in legal filings about his concerns for how the arrangement has been managed. A separate $250 million lawsuit filed by her ex-husband, Kevin Hunter, targeting the Guardian's conduct, was dismissed by a judge, and Wendy herself told TMZ she hadn't asked him to file it and didn't want him involved in her affairs. A Lifetime documentary about her situation added more public attention to the case, and her Guardian's team responded in court filings calling it a distorted portrayal, while Wendy's family described it as the most accurate account of her circumstances available anywhere. What's actually at stake in Wendy's case isn't a Hollywood conspiracy. It's one of the most serious and under-discussed legal issues in the country. How adult guardianship and conservatorship systems work, who gets to decide when someone has lost the capacity to run their own life, and how hard it can be to reverse that decision once a court has made it, even when new medical evidence contradicts the original finding. Legal experts and advocates who follow guardianship reform have pointed to her case specifically because it shows how these arrangements, which are meant to protect vulnerable people, can become very difficult to unwind, regardless of who the person is or how much public attention their case receives. So where does that leave these three stories? Gervais walked away from one hosting gig and kept everything else, because his career was never dependent on Hollywood's goodwill in the first place. Ellen went through a real, documented workplace accountability reckoning in 2020, weathered it publicly, and years later made an unrelated personal decision to relocate, which the internet has since flattened into a single dramatic narrative that isn't quite accurate. And Wendy Williams, the person who spent 30 years saying the things other people wouldn't, is the one still fighting the hardest right now, not against public opinion, but against a legal system that has to formally agree she's capable of speaking for herself again. Three very different outcomes. Three very different levels of power going into their respective situations, and only one of them still doesn't have full control over her own voice. If there's a thread that actually connects these stories, it's not a hidden conspiracy. It's a much simpler and more familiar pattern. How much protection you have when you say or represent something inconvenient tends to depend entirely on how much power you already had walking in. Gervais had financial independence and an audience that didn't depend on Hollywood approval. Ellen had a brand big enough to survive a real scandal and rebuild a quieter life on her own terms. Wendy had neither the outside platform nor the institutional protection, and she's the one who ended up losing control over her own life in the most literal, legal sense. What do you think happens next for Wendy Williams? Do you think the new medical evidence will actually be enough to end the guardianship, or is this going to keep dragging through the courts for years the way these cases so often do? Let us know what you think in the comments below. And if you want more deep dives into the real stories behind the headlines, make sure you're subscribed, because we're just getting started.